Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for sitting here for a couple minutes. We just had some background problems and we're all set and ready to go. So I would like to welcome you to the Cover Crop Usage Success and Limitations in Ontario. This webinar is focusing on the Ontario Cover Crop Report, which was recently released. Thank you so much to Callum Morrison for joining us from the University of Manitoba, and Dr. Yvonne Lawley as well joining us from the University of Manitoba. Callum is a graduate student at the University of Manitoba specializing in cover cropping on the Canadian prairies and in Ontario through the Ontario Cover Crop Feedback survey that we recently released. Callum has enjoyed connecting with farmers across 4 Canadian provinces for his research and learning about information and extension in agriculture. Dr. Yvonne Lawley is an assistant professor at the U of M. Her area of research is in agronomy and cropping systems. Dr. Lawley's research has focused on several cover crops, including soybeans, corn, and wheat, and a range of management practices that include residue management, strip tillage, and cover crops. So both of our guests today here are well versed in cover crops and cover crop usage across the country. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Callum and Yvonne. Take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Laura, and thank you to Grain Farmers of Ontario for hosting this webinar today, focused on the 2020 cover crop report that's based on a feedback project that was run during 2020 about cover crops. And it was a really great partnership between Callum and I at the University of Manitoba and the Ontario Cover Crop Strategy Working Group, of which Grain Farmers of Ontario is a main participant. And so thank you to the Cover Crop Strategy Group and to Grain Farmers of Ontario for enabling us to work with this group. Callum and I, of course, participated or led the prairie cover crop survey in 2020. And speaking with Anne Verhalen at OMAFRA, there was a really natural partnership there that evolved, and the ability to learn more about the adoption of cover crops across Canada by taking the survey to develop a project specifically for Ontario. And Ontario has, a wealth of experience with cover crops, is one of the leaders in cover crop adoption right now across Canada. And so it's a really exciting time to learn both about, what's going well and also what the current challenges are. That feedback has been really important for researchers like myself, as well as extensionists and policy analysts. And so it's a really important time for us to hear from farmers about cover crops in Ontario. And so, Callum is a graduate student with great enthusiasm and energy, and he brought that to the project. And I think we were also really well supported by the Ontario Cover Crop Strategy that worked with us to develop the questions and as well formulate the report so that it really matched the context of what is going on in Ontario right now. So I'm sure, just like me, you're anxious to hear about the Ontario Cover Crop Feedback Report. And I'm going to turn things over to Callum, who's going to lead us through how we set up the report and what the major findings were this morning.
Thank you very much, Yvonne and Laura, for those introductions. So my name's Callum Morrison. I'm a graduate student at the University of Manitoba, and I'm here along with Dr. Yvonne Lawley to talk to you about cover crop usage success and limitations in Ontario, as we found from our cover crop survey. So first of all, a little overview of today's talk. First of all, we're going to have a little intro just to define what exactly we meant by cover crops, and also how we were able to connect with the farmers that we connected with. Then we'll go into a little bit about our results. So we'll look at the respondent farms and their agronomy. We'll look at the benefits farmers have seen from cover crops as well as the problems. And then we'll have a look at how we can potentially enable adoption in Ontario. And then we'll discuss, we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have questions at any point, put that in the Q&A, and we will try and get round to it at the end. So first of all, what is a cover crop? Well, a cover crop is defined in this survey as a non-cash crop grown when the soil would otherwise be left bare. And it can be either interseeded into living crops or planted into bare fields during fallow periods. So in Ontario, this is commonly done after cash crop harvest, but also quite commonly as, say, frost seeding. And this includes, we included in our definition, cover crops that were grazed. So why exactly may farmers grow cover crops? Well, it's really important to state that the reasons farmers grow cover crops are very specific to that farm and depend on what that farmer would like to achieve. So farmers generally sit down and they think of what they'd like to achieve from cover crops, and then they choose cover crops that would help them to reach that goal, because each cover crop has different opportunities and also has different windows that they can work with. And some of these benefits cover crops may be able to achieve are improved soil health, and cover crops can really feed soil biology because we extend the period that plants are growing in the field. And when plants are growing, they're producing root exudates, which can really feed that soil biology at a time when the microbiology would otherwise be left hungry. It can also help to potentially build soil organic matter in our soils, and also potentially sequester carbon and also improve soil aggregation over time, which can help to increase infiltration rates. And we can also potentially protect against erosion, because obviously cover crops are covering the soil, their roots are there holding the soil together, so help protect against water and wind erosion, which can be a significant problem in certain parts of the province. And cover crops also, particularly legumes, can help to build soil nitrogen by taking nitrogen out of the air and fixing it with the help of rhizobium bacteria into the soil. And certain cover crops are also great at scavenging nitrogen, so taking excess nitrogen on the field and saving it into crop biomass. And then certain cover crops are also grown to suppress weeds. So our project had many different objectives. This included to gain feedback on the current extent of cover cropping in Ontario, so where cover crops are being grown and who's growing them. We wanted to identify how these farmers are actually being able to integrate cover crops into their system. We also wanted to understand why these farmers are growing cover crops. What are their goals? We wanted to see what benefits they'd actually seen and in what time scale. We wanted to have a look at the problems these farmers have experienced. And then we really wanted to have a look at farmers who haven't grown cover crops before, so we could understand the barriers that exist to widespread cover crop adoption, and then try and identify what could enable farms in the future to grow cover crops. So let's have a look at our survey. So we launched our survey between February 2021 and April 2021. And some of our questions were asked to all farmers. Some were only asked to those that grew cover crops in 2020, and some were only asked to farmers that didn't grow a cover crop in 2020. So all of our farms were asked basic questions to categorize farm type and size. Farms that grew a cover crop in 2020 were asked questions about their cover crop and how they grew their cover crop, as well as what benefits they'd seen and what challenges they'd faced. Farms that did not grow a cover crop in 2020 were asked about what barriers limit cover crop adoption for them and what they believe would help to enable cover crop use on their farm. So how exactly did we reach out to farmers? Very early on, we realized it was very, very important to be able to connect with farmers in a variety of different ways, so that we could reach out to farmers in every region of the province of many different farm types. I do want to just let you know that the survey is voluntary. We put it out there to farmers, and those which engaged responded. We didn't pay for the survey. The farms that responded were enthusiastic to tell us what they were doing on their farm. So Some of the networks we used were social media. We developed a social media presence, especially on Facebook and Twitter. 31% of the farms which took part heard about our survey through Facebook. 13% heard about it through Twitter. We also utilized the print media as well as radio, and we contacted dozens of newspapers across the province. And as you can see on the right of your screen, these are just some of the publications we appeared in. Some were local, some were provincial, and some were agricultural, but most were just sort of mainstream media publications. And we also were able to connect with networks that farmers' organizations already had. And most of these organizations were already members of the Ontario Cover Crop Strategy. And this group included members like the Grain Farmers of Ontario, Innovative Farmers of Ontario, and that just gave us another way to get out to farmers. So this helped us to connect with farmers right across the province of many different types. So some of the results. So we heard from 731 farmers right the way across Ontario. And I just want to take a moment to just say that that is a tremendous number. We believe this is the largest number of respondents who've taken part in a survey of this kind in Canada. And when we consider that these farmers were not paid, this is just farmers who were interested in sharing their story about cover cropping. That is a tremendous number. So 520 of these farms grew a cover crop in 2020, and they grew over 100,000 acres of cover crops in Ontario in 2020. We also heard from 211 farms that did not grow a cover crop in 2020, and it's very important that we also heard from that group, because that will really tell us what barriers exist to adopting cover crops in Ontario, and what we could potentially do to enable cover crop use in the province. So let's have a look at where the farmers that grew a cover crop in 2020 came from in the province. And as you can see by this map, we heard from farmers right the way across the province. In fact, there was only 3 counties and districts that weren't represented for this group of farmers. Those were Kenora and Cochrane in the far north of the province, and Haliburton. The counties with the highest concentration of farmers that responded were Huron. Huron had 40 farmers participating in our project who grew a cover crop, followed by Haldimand, Norfolk, and Middlesex. But as you can see, farmers, we had great distribution throughout the province for cover croppers. For farms that did not grow a cover crop in 2020, they came from right the way across the province again. There was 3 counties that weren't represented in the farms which didn't grow a cover crop in 2020. Those were Metro Toronto, Waterloo, and Hamilton. But again, farmers came from right the way across the province. And if we include both groups of farmers, those that grew a cover crop in 2020 and those who didn't, we actually heard from farmers right the way across the province in every single county and district. So if we look at farm type, for cover croppers, the majority of farmers identified as field croppers. So just over 75% of cover croppers said that they were field crop farmers. And 42% of people who grew a cover crop in 2020 told us that they were livestock farmers. And 23% of people who grew a cover crop told us that they were vegetable farmers. But we also saw many other farm types responding to our survey. For non-cover croppers, the majority of the farmers, 60%, told us that they were livestock farmers, 58% told us that they were field croppers, and 25% told us that they were vegetable farmers. If we look at farm size, we heard from farmers right the way from less than 4 acres all the way up to over 10,000 acres. So we had a good spread of farm sizes. The mode for both groups, so the most commonly occurring farm size, was between 180 and 499 acres. If we look at livestock on farms, both groups had quite a substantial number of farms had livestock. So a slight majority of farms that grew a cover crop in 2020 had livestock on their farms. 51% of people who grew a cover crop in 2020 had livestock on their farms. And the most common livestock species on cover crop farms that grew a cover crop in 2020 was beef cattle. And for no cover croppers, 66% of farms that took part, so about 2/3, had livestock on their farms. And once again, the most common species for farms that didn't have cover crops were beef cattle. So how long have farmers in Ontario that took part in our survey been using cover crops? Well, we found out that 95% of farms that took part had grown cover crops in a previous year. We found out that the most common length of time that farmers that responded to our survey told us they'd been using cover crops was between 3 and 5 years. So about 26% of farmers told us that they'd been utilizing cover crops for between 3 and 5 years. But there was still a substantial cohort of farmers who told us that they'd been growing cover crops for a long time. 18% actually told us they'd been growing cover crops for more than 26 years. So there's a very big range in the amount of time farmers have been growing cover crops in Ontario. So let's have a look at the different species of cover crops which are grown in Ontario. So by far the most commonly grown species as a cover crop in Ontario is oats, and that was grown by the majority of farms that took part in our survey and told us that they were growing cover crops. So 63% of the 520 farms that took part who grew cover crops told us that they grew oats, but we also saw fall rye, radish, red clover, and peas featuring prominently. Of the top 20 cover crop species grown in Ontario, 9 were legumes, 6 were annual grasses, 2 were brassicas. And of these top 20 species, cool season species predominate. In fact, of these top 20, only sunflowers, buckwheat, and sorghum Sudan grass we would regard as warm season. So what's very important for us to understand is what are the windows and opportunities for integrating cover crops in Ontario. So what's really important to then understand is what cash crops are grown before our cover crops. And in Ontario, we found out that the majority of people that responded to our survey told us that they were growing cover crops after their winter wheat. So 60% of our respondents grew cover crops after winter wheat, which makes it really important to consider if we want to look at how we can increase cover crop acres. Perhaps we have to look at winter wheat acres. But also the next two most common cash crops grown before cover crops were soybean, which was preceded cover crops in 21% of cases, and grain corn, which preceded cover crops for 15% of our respondents. So if we look at the number of species in cover crops, we found that farmers in Ontario were more likely to grow simple mixes of cover crops than complex mixes. So 43% of the farms that responded told us that they were growing just one species in their cover crop. And a further 43% of farmers told us that they were growing between 2 and 3 species in their cover crop. However, there were some farmers that are growing very complex mixes in Ontario. 5% of farmers told us that they were growing over 12 species in their cover crop mix. But for the most part, farmers are more likely to grow simpler mixes of species than more complex mixes of species. One question we really wanted to ask is, how does the diversity of cover crops change over time for the farms that responded? So we asked farmers, did they increase the number of species in their cover crop over time? Did they maintain it? Or did they decrease the number of species in their time? And the thinking behind this was that our farmers, starting with a simple mix, and then as they potentially gain confidence, they may want to add an extra layer of complexity and maybe increase the number of species in their mix. And what we found is that in 43% of cases, the diversity of cover crops did not change over time. And in 39% of cases, diversity did increase over time. In only 6% of cases, cover crop diversity decreased over time. So it appears that farmers are more likely to either increase or maintain the diversity of their cover crops. And only in a small number of cases, 6%, cover crops diversity is decreasing over time. So how are farmers starting their intercrop, and at what stage? So we found out that the majority of farms that responded, 70%, told us that they were planting their cover crop after cash crop harvest. We did find that the next most common way farmers are planting their cover crop was intercropped by frost seeding. And frost seeding involves quite often broadcasting a crop and using freeze-thaw action to get the seed into the soil to achieve good soil contact. And then when there's moisture and warmth in the spring, we can get germination. That's commonly used with red clover and winter wheat. So why are farms growing cover crops? And this is something, as I said before, really comes down to the goals. And then those goals will affect what cover crops farmers are using and the agronomy they're using. So it's very important to think about what are these farmers' goals. And we found out that for 85% of the farms that took part, they told us they were growing cover crops to build soil health. And in 83% of cases, the farmers told us that they were doing it to increase soil organic matter. But farmers were growing cover crops to provide many different potential benefits, such as control erosion, suppress weeds, especially weeds that are resistant to herbicides, to keep living roots in the soil, to feed soil biology and improve infiltration. But as you can see, many different reasons why farmers are growing cover crops in Ontario. So that's all well and good, but as farmers are always asking, what benefits can we actually expect to see with cover crops? So we asked farmers, what benefits have you seen? I should say that they just identified with the benefit they've seen. We don't know to what extent they're seeing this benefit, but they've agreed that they've seen this benefit. So the majority of farmers that took part, 91% told us that they'd seen benefits from growing cover crops, which is quite a positive result. So the most common benefit farmers told us that they've seen, which has been seen by 68% of farmers, so more than 2/3 of farmers, is improved soil health. The next most common, still seen by a majority of farmers, was less erosion. That was seen by 59% of the farms that took part. And also increased soil organic matter, which was seen by 57% of the farms that took part. But there's many other benefits that have been seen by farmers, including more earthworms, increased infiltration, less weeds, reduced compaction, increased biodiversity. And so it appears that there's many different benefits that can be seen on farms, not all of them seen by the majority, but that will depend on quite often the goals and what the farmer wanted to achieve, and also how long the farmer has been cover cropping, because some benefits can be seen relatively quickly, such as, say, if they want to reduce erosion, if they're looking to have grazing potential, pollination for bees and other pollinators, whereas certain benefits, such as, if you're wanting to sequester carbon, or change soil structure, those can take more years and accumulate with time. So feeding on from that, how long did it take these farmers to actually see benefits? And this was really surprising to myself and my professor, is how quickly farmers told us that they were seeing benefits. And 77% of farmers told us that they were seeing benefits within the first 3 years of growing a cover crop. And over 40% told us that they were seeing benefits from just 1 year of growing a cover crop. Of course, these benefits they may be seeing are likely to increase over time, but they're still telling us that they're seeing benefit from growing cover crops relatively quickly, which is a very positive indication from Ontario farmers. So how are cover crops influencing farm profit? And this is very important to a question to ask, because of course, farmers, there's business involved, and its economic importance of cover crops needs to be investigated. And we actually found out that in 37% of cases, farmers saw an increase in their profit. However, in 31% of cases, farmers told us that they saw no change in their profit. However, only 4% of farmers told us that they'd seen a decrease in their profit. So the majority of farmers either saw a profit or no change. However, if we look at unsure and depends on the year, on the right-hand side of the graph, 28% of farmers told us that they did not know really the influence of cover crops on the profit, or it depends on the year. So this is still an area to look at, but for the farmers that responded, only 4% of farmers were able to tell us categorically that cover crops were decreasing their profit. Another question we asked is, how exactly are cover crops influencing tillage? And this is a very important question to ask, because depending on your termination method of cover crops, you may actually increase tillage on your farm if you adopt them. And tillage is associated with negative soil health outcomes. So it was very important for us who were interested in soil health. We wanted to make sure that cover crops, if cover crops were affecting tillage usage. So we found out that in most cases, tillage is either decreasing or staying the same. We found in 44% of cases, tillage decreased after adopting cover crops. In 34% of cases, there was no change. However, in 17% of cases, it did increase. But more farmers are either are decreasing their cover crop, are decreasing their tillage or maintaining their tillage. So overall, a positive message coming out of tillage influence. So another question we ask is, how are farmers changing their cover crop acres over time? So are they increasing their number of acres over time? Are they not changing their acres, or are they decreasing them? And this, we thought, would be a good measure as well to see how confident farmers are that cover crops have a role on their farms, because you're only going to increase cover crops on your farm or maintain your acres if you really feel that cover crops have a place on your farm. And we found out that in 49% of cases, so almost 50% of cases, farmers increased their cover crop acres over time. And in 30% of cases, they didn't change their acres over time. In only 2% of cases, farms decreased their cover crop acres over time. So this is a strong indication that farmers are confident in the role that cover crops can have on their farms. So we can't talk about all these benefits of cover crops without acknowledging the challenges that surround integrating cover crops into farms in Ontario. And through identifying these challenges, we can provide these information on these challenges to farmers so that they can go into cover cropping knowing what challenges they may face. These farmers can then work out ways to potentially mitigate any of these problems they may face. And then policymakers and researchers and extension individuals can then look at how can we support farmers and where do we need to direct our efforts to make cover cropping more feasible in Ontario. So 82% of farms that took part in Grow a Cover Crop told us that they had experienced challenges while growing cover crops. And the most common problem that was seen by 30% of the farms that took part was that the cover crop either didn't grow or was too sparse, so essentially poor establishment. The next most common problem seen by 27% of the farms that took part was late harvest of cash crops preventing cover crop planting. And then the next most common was additional costs, seen by 25% of the farms that took part. But as you can see, there's many different problems experienced by the 520 farms that grow a cover crop in 2020. But as you can see, no one individual of these problems was seen by the majority of farmers. One other interesting thing I really need to say here is we gave farmers a list to select from if they'd seen this challenge. And one of the challenges we gave them was, do you agree with this statement that the old system that you used before you grew cover crops worked better? And out of the 520 farms that took part, who grew a cover crop in 2020, only one person told us that the old system worked better. So even though these farmers are seeing some challenges, only one farmer actually told us that they believe that they were better off before they started cover cropping. So that is potentially the one of the most positive indicators that farmers that took part told us that they were overall happy with cover crop use. So, as I said earlier, we also spoke to 211 farms across Ontario who did not grow a cover crop in 2020. And the reason for that was primarily to look at what barriers are limiting adoption and what we could do to potentially assist those farmers growing cover crops in the future. So, the most common barrier that farmers told us that they were facing to cover crop adoption were the additional costs. So 41% of the farms that didn't grow a cover crop in 2020 told us additional costs are a barrier. The next most common barrier farmers told us about was that lack of equipment. So 36% of farms that took part said lack of equipment is an issue for them. But then we also see late harvest of cash crop preventing harvest, but also in 24% of cases, farmers simply just told us it was just difficult to know where they could begin. So as you can see here, there's many different barriers, and by understanding this, we can see where maybe we need to focus our efforts to assist farmers if they so wish to grow a cover crop in the future. So very valuable information here. So we also wanted to see how could we enable use potentially in the future. And this is to just put out feelers and see, where maybe investment and research may need to be put in the future if we want to try and assist these farmers. So these took different focuses, whether they be financial incentives, looking at crop insurance, getting farmers additional information, creating local networks, as well as looking at information which is specific to farmers' regions or soils. So most farmers told us that they would respond positively to some form of financial incentives. So 53% of farms which didn't grow a cover crop in 2021 told us that they would be open to tax credits for planting cover crops, and that would enable them to use cover crops. 43% told us that payments for storing carbon may help them enable cover crop use. And 36% told us that payments from conservation programs or watershed groups would enable them to use cover crops. Interestingly, 21% told us that discounted crop insurance premiums would help them to grow cover crops. Also, a substantial number, 40% of farmers, told us that technical assistance would help to enable cover crop use, as well as a good proportion told us that 29% told us that information on cover crop agronomy would be useful for growing cover crops. But as I say, many farmers also really wanted local information. 26% said that information and research specific to their area would be key. 20% told us that information specific to their soil type would be useful. And 16% told us that local farm tours, so really creating that local network, would be useful to them. So as we can see, there's many potential for future research to see how these would work, but there seems to be many different opportunities we can take to support these farmers. So in summary, some major takeaways for you is the majority of farmers, 91%, told us that they've seen some form of benefits from growing cover crops. And these farmers told us that they were seeing benefits from growing cover crops relatively quickly. So 77% of farmers told us that they'd seen benefits within just the first 3 years of growing cover crops. The majority of farms, 82%, however, did tell us that they'd experienced some form of challenges. However, only one farmer out of the 520 farmers that grew a cover crop in 2020 told us that the old system for them worked better. So overall, still quite a positive message coming from Ontario farmers. And then we discussed potential methods to enable use, which may involve a combination of financial incentives, additional information, and local information for farmers, and fostering networks of cover croppers. So we need to thank the people who took part. It is fantastic that we heard from 731 farmers from every single county and district across Ontario. That is a tremendous number, especially when we consider that these farmers were not paid. They volunteered their time. They were willing to sit down with us and tell us their story. And that is fantastic and just shows how enthusiastic they are about this project and pushing, really helping us drive this research forward. And so to those who helped spread the word, called your neighbors, sent out an email, or even retweeted one of our posts, thank you. It was really exciting to experience the strength of networks that we have in the agricultural community through this project. We can accomplish so much when we work together. Quite often there's a feeling that maybe researchers and policymakers and farmers are not connected, but we really need to be. We all make this we all need to work together to ensure that that agricultural research works well and works well for the farmers on the ground. And through projects like this, where we're hearing directly from the farmers, which is essentially farmer-led research, we couldn't have done it without you. And hopefully more research like this is undertaken in the future. So have you got a question? If you have a question, put it in the Q&A and hopefully we can get round to you. We'll answer as many as we have time for. Or you can contact us directly if you have questions about the Ontario cover crop strategy in general. You can contact Marty Vermey, who is the Chief Agronomist at Grain Farmers of Ontario, and his email address is on the screen now. If you have questions about the Ontario Cover Crop Feedback Project, you can contact myself, who's the grad student at the University of Manitoba, who is one of the authors of the paper, or my professor, Dr. Yvonne Lawley, who's also an author of the paper, whose email address is on screen. So I will stop sharing now, and we can move on to our question and answer section of our webinar today.
That was great, Callum. Really appreciated the presentation you gave to the group today. I've been having a little bit of technical difficulty here, and I appreciate Laura kind of helping out. Also wanted to mention that the cover crop working group was essential in making this happen with everybody. I really do appreciate all the support and effort from the working group, which includes the Certified Crop Advisors Association, Conservation Ontario, Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Innovative Farmers Association of Ontario, Ontario Ag Business Association, the Ontario Federation of Ag, Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, Ontario Soil Network, the Ontario Soil Improvement Association, and Soils at Guelph. A lot of different groups out there really working together to make sure that, we get more knowledge and get a consistent message out there. And it was really great to have this survey to really understand what the barriers are and what farmers are finding as benefit. And as I wrote down, you indicated 91% of farmers see a benefit. And actually that starts into some of the questions. There's lots of questions in here. I'm not sure, Laura, if you wanted to take the questions or you want me to start firing them out, but there's some great questions coming in. And one of them, especially on that, I got to find it. Let me just start at the bottom and start in order. It's probably the best because there are lots of questions here, Callum. So Gord's asking the question, many respondents claimed improved soil health due to covers. What were some of the ways that this was assessed?
Well, maybe I can step in there, Marty.
Sure.
So for, a project that's based on survey, we're really relying on respondents, right? So we did not go and measure any of those benefits in this project. That's really something we have to do through another avenue of science. So it's really dependent on the respondents to determine how benefits were assessed. And so, that's a limitation of this kind of research. But I think as surveys feed into other forms of research, there's opportunities here to go and, develop projects where we can go and measure those. And I think many of those measurements on farms are happening in Ontario right now. And so that might be something that Anne could also speak to.
I think you have to keep in mind that this was an online survey and things were up to the guys themselves or the farmers themselves to answer it. If you want to look into some of the other details, that's hard to do. The other thing I think I'm not sure Callum really mentioned this, is this survey or feedback echoes the one that they did in the prairie. Mm-hmm. So keep in mind, this is part of his grad studies. So we needed to have the surveys be able to kind of mesh together. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's the level that it's at, but it's still wonderful information. And huge kudos to Callum for his persistence in getting out to every small town, it seems like, in Ontario. He now knows the Ontario geography, I think, better than I do.
Yeah, the diversity of the work that was done was great. I mean, it was all across Ontario. It was a great job, Callum. Another question came in from Cam was that he found it interesting that there is a large gap between cover crop adoption between livestock operations. And do you think this is because those farmers already have perennial forages and manure in the rotation, i.e. soil health is already high? And I kind of read into that a bit too. And when I looked at the survey, I kind of wondered that as well, as maybe farmers with livestock don't really see themselves planting a cover crop because they've already got forages and other things in their rotation. Just wonder, Callum, if you've been able to learn anything, or maybe Anne has an inside scoop on that as well.
I mean, I have my own theories, but I think Anne would be probably best to really answer that well. I mean, I think it also just depends who our group was. If you look at who the Ontario Cover Crop Strategy is, who helped primarily promote our survey, I think there's going to, because again, this isn't a census, it's farmers who responded, and most of the groups were, were mainly annual grain farmers anyway. Even though I did reach out to many of the agricultural groups and posted on, livestock groups and posted on livestock Facebook pages, I still think we may be farmers who were annual grain are more likely to hear. But also there's a lot of work done by annual grain farmers in Ontario on how to integrate cover crops into farms. But also if we look at the opportunities farmers have, winter wheat is by far, it has so many opportunities for cover cropping. So that also just might be who is growing winter wheat. But I'll let Anne have possibly some deeper insights into why we're seeing this.
Well, I think we captured at least some of the livestock, because we know that there's a lot of dairy producers who are using cover crops as an additional forage. And whether they identified that as a cover crop or not, that was entirely up to them. I know Callum also reached out to the sheep associations, and there's a lot more grazing going on of cover crops with both beef and sheep. And I think some of that was captured. But when you get into some of the livestock that is more grain based in its feed, so the hogs and the birds, I think it becomes a little harder for some of them to insert cover crops unless they've got a fair bit of wheat in their rotation.
Terry's asking a question. He's curious, what's the difference between the two categories, regenerative versus sustainable farms? Anybody got an answer for Terry?
Oh,
I can jump in there, Callum. I think, again, coming back to the survey format, right? We were asking farmers to pick descriptors that identify their farms. And so, as regenerative agriculture has sort of emerged as a new form of agriculture, and perhaps the definition of what regenerative agriculture is still evolving. I think there is blurriness in those different labels and definitions at this point in time. So it was really interesting to see how many farmers from Ontario selected these different descriptors, just from like a social science perspective here on survey responses. It was interesting to me also, like having done the Prairie survey versus the Ontario survey, we had a lot more farmers in the prairies identify as regenerative farmers who responded to our Prairie survey compared to the Ontario survey. I think we still saw a lot more farmers describe themselves as sustainable.
I think part of the reason why there's a difference between the prairies and Ontario is on the prairies, they don't, there's a much higher proportion of early adopters than there are in Ontario, where it's becoming more and more increasingly mainstream in Ontario. Whereas in Manitoba, quite often it's really enthusiastic early adopters who are more likely, I believe, to identify as regenerative. But it is that interesting thing that these words, sustainable and regenerative, appear that they don't mean the same thing to everyone. So yeah, that's
It's an interesting find, and it'll be interesting, if a survey like this is redone in the future, what kind of descriptors do farmers use in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yep, terminology changes over time. That's for sure.
That's right. Yeah.
Next question is from Gord. He's wondering if you're able to correlate greater, quicker increase in soil health when covers were used more often during a crop rotation. Example, just after winter wheat versus after wheat plus corn, and like a more comprehensive. I don't think the survey really dug that deep into that, but Callum, I don't know if you have any comments you want to add to that.
I don't, as we say, we didn't ask that specifically. I know for my, it's something which would be really cool to look into, but we didn't really ask that specifically, and it gets a bit difficult trying to infer things that we never asked. And just as a grad student, I want to play it safe rather than...
I think there are some opportunities within the data set because it's so large to take a look at some specific groups. And that is some of the work that Callum is doing with both the Prairie and the Ontario data sets. So because there was such great response, we have so many responses, we are able to take a look at some of the different groups. So thanks for that question. I mean, we can take a look at what's going on or what kind of responses in terms of soil health benefits or benefits occur from farmers who have maybe adopted cover crops for 10 or more years compared to those that are just new adopters. So those are some great thoughts that we can take a look at in more depth in this data set. But as Callum mentioned, the design of a survey doesn't necessarily allow us to go and answer all questions, but it certainly brings out new ideas. And I'm really excited as a researcher in cover crops and a collaborator with colleagues across the country about the potential to develop new ideas and go in new directions from this feedback.
Another question, Helen's asking, do you think that the high number of responses that are dependent on the year, unsure, or no change suggests that farmers need better cost-benefit analysis tools on cover crops?
I think that's very clear. From this and also the question about profitability, we're talking about the question about profitability, that the economics of cover crops is an important area to address. Having calculators or just having a framework that farmers can use to quickly go through their cost benefit analysis for their own farm. And, those benefit, how people view benefits changes with time. So I think it's also great to have tools that help farmers who are just adopting cover crops, who may be looking for those short-term economic equations, as well as those that are maybe starting and want to invest in some of those long-term benefits. So I think that's a real strong point that comes out of the survey, that future work is needed to make this cost-benefit analysis accessible for farmers.
And Anne does a lot of work out there, a lot of measurements. I wonder, Anne, if you have any comments on this question.
Well, with that one and actually the previous one, you got to remember that this is a survey. So there are limitations to it. Meanwhile, there is some great research going on, some longer term cover crop research that's just actually, if you look in your farm publications this week, I think you'll see a report on some of the work by Laura Van Eerd, and talking about yield increases and starting to put the economics to it on longer term cover crop adoption. There's also another plot that's hosted by Dave Hooker at Ridgetown. There's another one in Elora that's looking at all these mixes and incorporating them in different tillage systems too, and different rotations. And I think give us a little bit of time. Those are very controlled circumstances, so it's easier to follow. And the other part that you probably should also take a look at it is the Soil and Crop has a very large across the province project called On Farm. A lot of those plots are looking at cover crops and cover crop comparisons. So again, there's some of that information being developed. It's not here yet, or it's only here in part, but it's coming. It'll be here in the next couple of years.
That's really exciting to hear about, Anne. Coming from the prairies, where we're, a good distance from where the research is in Ontario right now, that some of those frameworks are going to be here in short order.
Josh has a question here. Do you feel that the observations of farmers noting soil health benefits and the perceived effects are quantifiable?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that we can go and measure soil health benefits from cover crops on farms, but it's expensive and it takes a lot of time and labor. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I think if we think about the purpose of a survey, mm-hmm. We are looking for the responses of individuals from farms, right? And mm-hmm. so I think that what we can learn from this survey is how the managers of each of these farms see the benefits, right? Because they are the ones integrating a lot of information and making decisions. And I think you also need to put the types of respondents in context too when evaluating the results of the survey, right? Because it was a voluntary survey, we are going to get those who are most engaged and interested in cover crops and responding. So hopefully the results of this survey that really relied on those who are really interested in cover crops to inspire future surveys. Maybe the census starts involving some questions about cover crop adoption in Ontario and hopefully across Canada, as well as other types of farm surveys that are done on a more frequent basis. I think it's clear from this initial survey that there's a place for asking about cover crops in much of the work and much of the survey work that's done in Canada at this point.
And the second part of Josh's question, and maybe I'll ask Anne on this one, but Josh is kind of wondering, have these benefits been scientifically demonstrated in such a manner that could influence regulation? So just wondered, Anne, in the work that you've done as well with some of these benefits, can they help with some policy and with government regulation? Do you see a fit there?
I think we're getting a better information package around cover crops. I think there's a lot of things around environmental benefits that we certainly have proven, as far as being able to scavenge excess nitrogen, scavenge and hold phosphorus. Some of those things, even just in terms of preventing erosion and keeping particulates out of water courses. So yeah, we do have a lot of these benefits that have been scientifically demonstrated. Could that influence regulation? Josh, I'm not going there.
Katie asked a question here. What would cause an increase in tillage from cover crop use? I'll let Anne answer that one.
Oh, well, that's an easy one, actually. Anytime, and it's an easy one in terms of some people are applying their cover crops with a little bit of tillage where maybe they weren't before. So a cheap way of planting a cover crop would be to broadcast it with some of their fertilizer in the fall. Well, best practices also suggest we need to get that fertilizer in the soil. We also know we're going to get better emergence of cover crops in the fall if we've got them in close contact with the soil. So that's one part. The other part comes in the spring. If we've had too much growth of cover crops, especially on some heavier soils, I will put that in the chat in a second. We could have too much residue to deal with. And there tends to be a response that will do a little bit more tillage. You got to remember, a lot of times we're starting out with cool, wet soils, a little bit different than the prairies.
I think one thing that was interesting when we asked survey respondents about their tillage system, and I don't think Callum included that graph in this presentation, but we asked farmers that participated in the survey about their tillage system, and the majority of farmers that participated in the feedback project were already practicing some form of conservation tillage. So I would say, again, sort of interpreting the results of this feedback in that context is we're already dealing with people who are practicing or interested in conservation tillage.
I actually see that we're at our hour mark right now, but I think we have great conversation dialogue, and I see people are still staying on. So I'm going to keep asking some questions here. I got a whole bunch of questions still to go through, and I was going to filter through them all, but I really don't want to miss anybody. So I'll just keep reading off some of these. So everybody, thank you for staying with us, and we'll just keep dialoguing and talking about the report and some observations that we've made through the report. So Angie's asking, improved soil health is a very subjective observation from respondents. We know uptake of commercial soil health tests and biological indicator measurements are relatively low. Were any prompts or definitions given in the survey for soil health indicators?
No, and that was really on purpose again, just like the question about identifying the characteristics of your farm, sustainable versus regenerative. We were really looking for people to, interpret for themselves whether they see benefits, rather than to be very descriptive in telling us like this is a quantifiable benefit, or not quantifiable, but this is the types of benefits that we're looking for. Yeah. So for this survey, it's really just, does the farmer, in whichever way, whichever goal they've set for their farm, do they see benefits?
And that goes for just about every question, does the farm, and that's just because we ask farms, for example, do you identify as a livestock farm annual grain? Well, that's for the farmer to identify, and you can see the differences between how we ask certain questions. That if you ask, do you identify as a livestock, we get a certain percentage, but then what species do you have in your farm will give you a different percentage, because you may have a few cattle on your farm, but it's not your main business. So it's when we're dealing with people, it's as much about our individual thoughts and ideas as, and I feel with agriculture, quite often people forget the importance of the human element and identifying and, goals and fears and, interests. And I think that that's how this can complement traditional research.
Callum, a question here from Josh. He's wondering if the survey asked the questions surrounding the usage of cover crops on leased farmland and the potential issues with the economics.
Well, we did ask in terms of, we asked farmers if they owned all their land right the way through to rented all their land. And we found farmers were more likely to own or rent a small amount than rent all of their land. It's something we could potentially look into, and I would like to look into for my survey, because of course we can our data set is so large, we can sort of separate out people who own more than rent more and look at how, the decisions they're making potentially. It's not something I've broken down yet, but the Christmas holidays are coming up, and that's something I'd like to to go into. And so
that'd be interesting if you have the data, because I know anecdotally a lot of people think that, right? Farmers that own the land, they'll invest in their own land, use cover crops, longevity. And if it's rented land, it's probably not so much. So it'd be interesting if your data kind of shows that.
Yeah, that's one of my sort of thinkings, but sometimes what we think isn't what actually happens on the ground. So
Angie's asking regarding challenges, wouldn't late harvest of a cash crop and cover crop didn't establish be correlated?
Yeah, many of our responses, of course, will be tied. They're slightly different, but of course they are correlated. But that goes with just about anything. They're linked on a farm. Everything is interlinked and everything works together. But yes, and certain things, like if you're, for example, another question we had is are you looking to feed soil biology, or are you looking to keep roots in the soil? So both of those things are linked. They're both slightly different, but they're both interlinked. So, many of the things we do are obviously go hand in hand, but they're slightly different, and it's important to ask questions in different ways for survey research.
Callum, Katie's asking, for farmers who did not grow a cover crop in 2020, were those farmers who never grew cover crops or just in 2020? And in my interpretation, when I read through it, it was like, it was really asking the question about 2020, because otherwise it gets really convoluted and it's really hard to peel it apart. So you just kind of look at 1 year. And that's why I forget what the percentage was, but there was a group that had grown cover crops before, but just not in 2020.
Yeah, I will get that just for you in a second, because I did have these ready in case I was asked questions about some of our other. Yes, because we did it. All of our results are a snapshot of 2020, as you said, and of the farms that didn't grow a cover crop, just over half said that they'd never grown a cover crop before, but they wanted to try. So this group of non-cover croppers in 2020, the majority of them hadn't grown cover crops but were keen to try. There was 9% of the farmers who had never grown a cover crop before and just did not want to try. But 39% of that group did have some previous experience with cover crops. So it is a group which seems to quite positively view cover cropping in general. But
I think we expected that, Callum, too, because of the voluntary nature of the survey. I think it was expected that. I'm just impressed that we got 9% of farmers that had never grown cover crops and never wanted to grow cover crops even respond to our survey. I mean, that was unexpected.
It was very hard to get people who, because I really wanted to hear from farmers who are not considering it at all, but it was very, very, very difficult to reach out to that group. And, we still have very valuable data. And sometimes, perhaps people who are on the fence are probably the people we're most likely to actually be able to move the dial. If we do more information, in the future, we do this again, hopefully we can get more people who have never grown and do not want to grow. But
Lauren's asked a question here. Did you collect information to connect responses back to soil type? We know that many benefits and challenges are related to cover crops and can be dependent on soil type, especially clays. And it would be interesting to see how that affected the perceptions of adoption.
Yeah, I think that would be a great question for future research to look at. And one of the options that we gave in terms of looking what would enable you for future adoption was to have research that's specific to a specific region or a specific soil type.
Sandra is wondering what cover crops are best for weed suppression. I'll leave that one for Anne.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do and when you're trying to suppress those weeds. There's a fair bit of work that's been done by Dr. Francois Tardif here at the University of Guelph, looking at using cereal rye for weed suppression, particularly herbicide-resistant weeds. There's been a fair bit of use of warm season cover crops, particularly by organic growers, things like buckwheat and sorghum Sudan for weed suppression midsummer. So there is some information about that. I would suggest you try Field Crop News. That's one place that would have some of the most recent Ontario information, or reach out to me. I've got my email address in the chat, and I can direct you to some places where you can get further information.
Another one for you, Anne. Chris is asking, what was the most common way to terminate the cover crop? Oh, sorry, that was about the survey. So Callum, I'll let you answer that and probably get back to Anne about if there's ways to terminate.
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, I'll just get down there to that question so I can get you up to date things. Okay, so in Ontario, the most common method that farmers told us that we were using was herbicide. So the majority, 56% of farmers told us that they were terminating with herbicide, but then followed by winter kills. So 45% of farmers told us that their cover crop was killed by over the winter period. But we also saw tillage or incorporation, mowing, as well as small number, less than 10% of farmers told us that they were grazing the cover crop as a method of termination. And then 6% told us roller crimping, and then a very small proportion of farmers, 4%, told us that they were using tarp, plastic mulches to terminate their cover crop, and that is more horticultural producers. So we have a variety, but the majority of farmers told us that they were using herbicide, and then the next most common form was winter killing.
And Ian, that's probably what you see out in the field as well, right?
It is. And the other thing, there's a nuance here, because I think you have to keep in mind that what Colm showed is that most people, the greatest majority, are establishing their cover crop after winter wheat. So we typically have a lot of volunteer winter wheat, which is going to live through the winter. And that's where some of that additional or some of that herbicide use is coming from, because it's not going to die, even if they put a mixture down that would winter kill. So it's not surprising that the herbicide is showing up as one of the larger ones. That, and the fact we've had several very mild winters where we've seen things like oats and radish over winter and still require control come spring.
Paul's asking a question. You asked whether incentives would encourage adoption. Was there any questions about whether farmers took advantage of existing incentives like CAP or from conservation authorities?
That would have been a great question to include looking back, but no, we did not ask about their current participation in programs right now.
Yeah, there's lots of questions that would have been great for us to answer, and that's definitely one of them. But problem is we're trying to do the trade-off of having a certain length survey so that people will respond. But that I would have loved. I also would have loved, we asked where farmers get their information, but I would have loved, which one of these do you value the most? These sort of questions, and that question would have been a fantastic one. And this is things to watch for, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, when we want to do a follow-up survey. These are the questions that we can add in now that we know that farmers want to participate in these surveys. So,
yeah, it was a key thing. Participation was great. Katie's asking, how were the surveys delivered? Did someone sit and speak to each farmer, or was it delivered? Was it online? And I think Yvonne already answered that one by saying, or maybe it was Anne just saying that this was done online. And Callum, maybe you could add a little bit, because I know you were very active in reaching out online to a lot of different groups.
Yeah, it was online, but we reached those farmers in many different ways. So for the most part, farmers heard via social media, and some of that is direct me posting. Some of it is, so I joined literally thousands of local Facebook groups, and I asked people, look, I'm doing this. I'm trying to reach out to people of different farm types and in different locations. And that gave us the opportunity to make sure that we heard from people across Ontario. We also reached out to, there was the initial groups that are members of the Ontario Cover Crop Steering Committee, but I also reached out to groups out with the committee itself so that we could ensure that we got as full a picture of cover cropping in Ontario. And but also, I did ask people to identify cover croppers or other prominent farmers in the industry. And I actually did call certain farmers to say, look, we're doing this. Can you suggest other people? Maybe share it with your networks. So it was a very almost grassroots, farmers suggesting other farmers, and then sending on the link, farmers sharing my tweets, farmers, so it's known as snowball sampling, that you get farmers to suggest other people, but we contacted them directly, we contacted them indirectly through organizations. And then of course you got the media. So in terms of the radio and the newspapers, and that gave us the chance to get to different demographics of farmers. So not just those who are on Twitter, and that's a different group from those who are on Facebook, and that's a different group for those who read print media, and different group for those who listen to CBC. So it helped us to really try and get as broad a base of farmers as we could.
Yeah, you were very effective at it, Callum. And I think also the number of organizations involved in the steering team, and then them reaching out, but also you doing it on social media. That really, really made a difference. You can't just find one way, right? There's just not one way of doing it. So,
Yeah.
Stuart's asked the question about organic. Did you have any findings pertaining to organic operators specifically, and ask respondents to identify if they were organic? And I know you had it listed as far as their type, but I know you had organic in there. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, we asked organic in two different ways. The first was when we asked them to categorize the farm type, but then we also had an individual question, sort of like how we had two ways to measure livestock, if they're identified as livestock and then actually, what they had on the farm. So we asked farmers if they were not organic, if they were used organic management but weren't certified, if they were certified on all their farm, or if they were certified in some. And we found out that for both groups, those who grew a cover crop in 2020 and those who didn't, the majority of farmers were not organic. Only 6% of farms that grew cover crops were identified, were certified organic, and only 1% of farms that did not grow cover crops were certified organic. And really, really less than 1% of farms that were, but it made up a small percentage of our farmers, and that is it's very different to the results we got on the prairies. I believe off the top of my head for the prairies, 26% of farmers told us that they were organic, certified organic. So big difference between Ontario and the prairies. But 6% of farms were actively certified organic who had cover crops.
I think that also relates to, the nature of surveys, right? So we could only talk about those that responded to the survey. And so we may be underrepresenting cover crop use on organic farms in Ontario just from those that responded to the survey. So something to look at in the future in terms of context of cover crops for organic farms in Ontario.
Next question I have is for Anne. Anne, Josh is wondering about, he's going to be no-tilling corn into alfalfa this spring. He's wondering, how do I figure out my nitrogen credit?
Well, I go back to our agronomy guide. We give nitrogen recommendations when you terminate a forage crop like alfalfa. And so if you go there, again, reach out to me and I can send you that if you don't have access to it.
And I'll also add, if you're putting manure on there, make sure you add credit for the manure as well.
Good point.
Roland's asking a question. Was there any follow-up to ask what kind of knowledge would be needed by the farmers who have not adopted cover crop yet? Does it have to do with economics benefits or rather agronomy?
Again, I think that's a great question, Roland. Let's add that to our next survey.
Yeah. One question which was fantastic was suggested by one of the members who helped us build this survey was what we allowed farmers to select the top three characteristics, and I'm saying a question like that where you were able to identify the top three or the top two of a question like this would have been really invaluable to really measure which one is that would help us to quantify in terms of the importance to farmers. So this is all things, again, as I say, to bear in mind for next year. And as we've noticed that when we moved from the prairie survey to this survey, we had many improvements. And now we've learned all these things. We know now what farmers actively want to say. So now next time we do this survey in the future, when we do follow-ups, we have these great questions we can ask.
Callum, when I was reading through the survey, I was really intrigued that the breakout between those using cover crops and those not using cover crops, and those not using cover crops, I think 40% needed more technical assistance. They wanted some financial assistance, but they also need technical. And I thought maybe those using cover crops, they just need, financial assistance to continue and wouldn't need technical, but they still down the line a little bit, they still wanted technical. I forget what the number was, but it was still up there a fair bit. Farmers still want to continue to have that technical experience. A lot of them are adopting it. But, sometimes you run into hurdles and you need to adopt and change things. And they just need that technical expertise to say, okay, this didn't work. What do I try next? Right. So we need to continue that kind of education.
I think agronomists have a really important role to play right now with cover crop adoption. Like we talk about like the prairies or Ontario, where do we move next? And I think having agronomists that are well tooled and comfortable talking with farmers about cover crops is going to be a really important driver for expanding adoption.
Yeah, and as Marty was saying, about 20% of farmers who grew cover crops said technical assistance would help them continuing using cover crops, and with people who didn't grow a cover crop, about 40% said that technical assistance would be useful. And I think part of that is farmers are lifelong learners, like everyone, and they're constantly trying to innovate new ways and find how they can integrate cover crops into, other parts of their farm. So I think that it's just showing that, where farmers are with their cover crops, it's quite often a dynamic goal that's changing. As we saw before, farmers are increasing the number of acres in their farms quite often over time. A number of them are increasing the diversity over time. They're innovating and finding new ways. So I think that's what that's alluding to there, that even though a farm may have adopted cover crops, that's probably not how they're going to be cover cropping in a few years' time. They may be changing and looking for new ways to improve what they're doing. So I think that's why we're seeing that.
Helen's asking a question about land tenureship, and I know we kind of touched on it a bit already, but I just want to make sure I answer her question completely here. So, and she's wondering about the adoption of cover crop with land tenure. So Callum, did you ask a question about it? And yes, you did. And she noted that you asked about land size. It was unclear about tenureship and what the area was farmed. Could you throw out some numbers? Do you remember what some of it was as far? Yeah.
No problem. I've got the report up, so it'll always take me a few seconds to find it. So yes, we found out that a third of farmers told us that they owned all their land. We found out that 28, this is just of the people who grew a cover crop in 2020, I should say. 33% of those who grew a cover crop told us that they owned all their land. 28% said that they owned more land than they rented. 25% said they rented about 50-50. Only 14% of farms that grew a cover crop said they rented more farmland than they owned. So it definitely seems to be weighted towards owning all their land. But interestingly, for farms that did not grow cover crops in 2020, 56% owned all their land. So that just looking at my results again there, it doesn't seem that's very interesting, considering that only a third of farms that grew cover crops owned all their land, but over half of farms that did not grow a cover crop in 2020 owned all their lands. So it's going to be really important for us to really look at these different groups and try and discuss why that's happening.
Yeah, I was surprised reading the report when I seen that. I thought it would have been the other way around, but for sure. Yeah. David's asking a question here. If you're aware of any research into how farmers can implement more cover crops, examining the mechanisms that connect best with farmers. Maybe Anne could take a stab at this question.
Wow, the sociology part is really critical, and we're aware of it. I think Helen's on this call, and she's certainly working with her students to do some of that work. There's been a number of studies, both at the University of Guelph, I think University of Windsor had some, and there's certainly some studies across the Midwest. A lot of it comes back to, not surprisingly, farmers identify peer-to-peer, working with other farmers, as probably the best way to share some of that information, which again takes you back to why there's programs like the Living Lab and On Farm, where it is on-farm demonstrations and the chance to go out and like kick the cover crop and talk to the farmer who's doing it. So yeah, there is research out there. There's more being done all the time, because that's a tough one.
I'll move on to the questions because we still want to kind of wrap this up here shortly. Jamie's asking a question about the definition of cover crop is too narrow. Should it include winter wheat and perennial forages, as these also cover the soil? And that's a really big topic and lots of debate with a lot of groups. But yeah, we'll take a stab at it here. Anne, do you have any comments on that?
Sorry, better repeat that. I got distracted reading another question.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, Jamie's kind of wondering about the definition of cover crop. He thinks it's too narrow. And should it include winter wheat and perennial forages, as these are also these crops cover the soil. And it really gets, what is the definition? Who's defining it, right? So if it's policy and you're getting a payment, well, that person doing the payment's going to define what the cover crop is and how they measure it, right? And what they're going to pay for. So,
yeah. And I think it was pointed out in another question that the definition we used for this doesn't quite match the one that's used for the steering committee for cover crops in Ontario. We were trying to use a cover crop definition that was consistent.
Yeah.
Really.
No.
And yeah, it does. They make a point about winter wheat and all the rest. We get those environmental benefits, but for this purpose, this survey was just focused on cover crops, or what Cam sometimes calls service crops, things that are purposely planted for that purpose. So I don't know, maybe Callum can add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I know for myself, when I was having people kind of on the fence of whether to, I kind of said it was the intention that mattered. Are you doing it primarily for, environmental, economic, erosion benefits type thing? And that was kind of for me, as opposed to a cash crop. But I mean, this is where any talk about cover crops will ultimately come down to this debate. And as we said, what one farmer defines as a cover crop is not what another farmer defines as a cover crop. But I would imagine in the coming years, as cover crops come more and more mainstream, we will probably have better definitions. But, I think it's quite often a scale, because as you say, winter wheat, it does have many of the benefits we would associate with cover cropping. But as you say, it doesn't meet all of the things we'd class. And I mean...
The one thing I would add to this debate about what is and what is not a cover crop, and I think it's more clear in Ontario than it is in the prairies right now as to what a cover crop is, is cover crops are a means to an end, right? Cover crops in themselves, just having a cover crop isn't why we're doing this, but it's to achieve those benefits. And so that is really what we're getting at here with this question as to what is and what is not a cover crop. And we recognize the benefits that come with winter cereals, and we recognize the benefits that come with perennial forages. And so I think that the net win in all of this is that the more we talk about cover crops, the more farmers are tuned into what really are those benefits from having those in the rotation and having that diversity. So whether that perennial cover comes from perennial crops, from winter cereals, or from cover crops, we're all working towards that end goal, which is why we are involved in these and thinking about these practices. I think what really cuts across this question is, what are the opportunities going to be for investments, for other revenue streams from farmers in the future? And so I think that is well beyond the scope of this survey, but hopefully this survey helps inform those policy questions moving forward.
Roland's asking a question about carbon accounting. I was wondering if we know of an easy way which farmers can estimate their cover crop biomass productivity. I don't know, maybe Anne or Yvonne, you've got maybe some ideas?
I think this is an active area of research right now. And I would love to hear a bit more from Anne, because I think she has a lot more experience specific to Ontario in terms of quantifying biomass and where those policy kind of questions. I think again, this question relates to policy, right? And being able to track change over time.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. We do have good biomass numbers on cover crop, but that doesn't necessarily translate to carbon accumulation in the soil that's lasting. And that's the other challenge with cover crops, is that they can be very short-term or transient. Huge policy question, lots of discussion, and at the same time, also some ongoing research. So again, I'm going to direct you back to Laura Vineyard's work, where she was working with a lighter sandy loam, fairly high organic matter, and after 10 plus years of dedicated cover crops and embedded into a field crop vegetable rotation, actually measured quantifiable carbon increases And it's playing out not just in higher carbon, but actually in higher yields, which I think is really significant. That's when it starts to pay for itself on the farm. The overall carbon question, we've got a lot more work to do on that, I think.
I think there's lots of hope for the future in terms of the use of satellite technology, digital agriculture. Like all of these tools are coming on board. I think where we're what's going to take the time is the boots on the ground, the verification work, right? And there's nothing but people, time, money in creating a data set that would allow us to implement those kinds of remote sensing digital approaches to quantifying cover and their potential connection to soil carbon. A whole career there of work.
I have another question here from Angie. She's assuming that the survey was anonymous and that you have no way of sending participants the results directly. Are you sharing the results as widely as you shared the survey request, or using the same medium? So Callum, I know you've been trying to reach out back to those people, but it depends on whether they gave you their email or not. So I'll let you answer that.
We asked farmers, I believe, 3 questions that did they want to, if we did a similar survey in the future, would they like to hear from us again? If they wanted a copy of the report, and I believe there was one other thing we asked them. So we had to be careful because, as you're right, the survey's anonymous. We can't have any fears that we may accidentally release anyone's information. So we had to take straight away out the emails from our data set and keep them separately. So then what happened is, if the farmer said they wanted a report, they were sent it. Because a number of farmers didn't share their email, and that's perfectly fine. That's how we can do a survey like this. And so the farmers who asked for it, I sent it out. And unfortunately, some of those emails, it appears there may have been some spelling mistakes or something in there, but it's not like I can go in and correct it and assume what their email was. But it went out to everyone who requested. And then I posted in all of the agricultural Facebook pages that I had initially posted. I've put it out on Twitter several times. I shared it we did a massive press release with all the publications in Ontario that we could find. And we've also, we've gone through many different channels. So, and it's also free to use for anyone on the Grain Farmers of Ontario website. It's free for farmers to use, free for agronomists. It's there. We want everyone to be able to have access to it. So we've tried to reach out again, and it's out there.
Yeah, and if there are those that are interested in partnering in sharing this information, I think both the Cover Crop Steering Committee or Callum and myself are very open to helping those access the survey.
Cam's asking a question here. There's a larger livestock contingent among non-cover croppers. Would those operation types have difference in land ownership? You probably have to dig for that, right?
I'd have to dig. And I mean, it's possible for me to do, because all I simply need to do is just kind of sort by the livestock people and sort by. Of course, whenever you do that, there's still some noise, because farmers could identify as more than one thing. It's just like people. You can be a Canadian citizen and a British citizen. You appear in both boxes, but you can start to kind of look. And I mean, it's a bit difficult because it can be chicken and egg type thing, but you can see where there is, where there is some form of a relationship, but you can't quite often say this because of this, but you can say this is where, there is potentially something happening. So.
Another question from Linda: is cover cropping the same as intercropping?
Oh, that's a great
question. That's a nice one, yeah.
That's something that really Callum and I started paying attention to from the prairie survey, because we found that a lot of people using cover crops in the prairies were establishing them as intercrops. And so moving to the Ontario context, we already knew about the connection between red clover and winter wheat. And so it was really important to look at intercropping in the context of cover cropping. And to me, intercropping is, establishing two plants together. And so right now, because of the growing interest in intercropping for grain production, I think that we automatically go and apply that terminology thinking about grain production, but it's just a tool, right, to establish two plants together. So it's a management practice that can be utilized for cover crops and perennial crops for that matter. So I think intercropping is just a means to get to an end. And I think that, with row crops like corn and soybeans, it's also an important strategy for trying to establish. So there's lots of terminology that we're sorting out right now. There's intercropping, there's also interseeding, and relay cropping that all sort of tie in and feed into the practices that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of gray areas and fuzziness of when and it can be more than one thing.
A lot of terms, for sure. And the very last question that I'll ask is, Sebastian's wondering, do you think the development of a schism on cover crop value on real-time with technology will be a great project to capture the value of the cover crop in soil health, evolution, and increase the adoption? I think sure.
I think that's a great comment.
Yeah.
Sounds like we've inspired some new projects through our.
I think there'd be some great stuff that can happen.
Today.
Yep. More of a comment, but yeah. No, it's great. Hey, I want to thank everybody for their time and saying an extra a little over half an hour. So I do appreciate that. This is recorded and it will be posted on our website at Grain Farmers of Ontario. Grain Farmers of Ontario, why we're doing this is that we lead the cover crop steering team in Ontario with the group that I mentioned before. I think there's about 10 organizations involved with it, leading it in Ontario. So greatly appreciate all the support from those organizations as well. And I do want to give a thanks to Anne Verhollen and Laura Vineyard, who's really helped capture some of the questions correctly in the survey that we did. We did a subgroup. We didn't do the whole committee as we kind of worked on this project because, as you can imagine, you get a lot of people together. It goes in a lot of different directions. It takes a lot longer. We were able to get this done in the springtime, turned around the questions and had it to growers in the springtime to understand 2020 cover cropping, and really do appreciate Callum and Yvonne's work in the survey and the work that they've done in summarizing it and making it available for everybody in Ontario to learn and understand cover crops better. And there's a lot of people looking for this information, a lot of questions we've had. Now we actually have some data to say, hey, this is what farmers are thinking and this is what's working for them. This is not what's working for them. And how can we move the bar on cover crops? So thank you everybody for your support and your help. Thank you.